The Complete History of Tobacco, From Sacred Ritual to Global Addiction, History to Sleep. Good evening and welcome to Boring History to Sleep. Tonight, we are going to explore the story of a plant that has, perhaps more than any other, intertwined itself with the destiny of humanity. It is a plant that was once considered a divine gift, a bridge to the spirit world, and a sacred medicine. Over the course of 5 centuries, it would transform into a global commodity, the engine of empires, the cornerstone of vast fortunes, and ultimately, the agent of a worldwide addiction that claims millions of lives each year. This is the long, complex, and deeply contradictory history of tobacco. From the quiet peace pipes of pre-Columbian America to the boardrooms of multinational corporations, we will trace the journey of these deceptively simple leaves. Before we light the first ceremonial fire of our story, we would love to know where you are joining us from tonight. What time is it in your corner of the world as you prepare for rest? Let us know in the comments below. Now, find your most comfortable position. Let your body grow heavy, sinking into the soft support of your bed. Close your eyes and quiet your mind. Our journey begins long before the clamor of the modern world, in a time when the smoke that rose from the earth was not a product, but a prayer. Chapter 1. The Pre-Columbian World, a Sacred Plant. Our story begins not in a factory or a boardroom, but in the rich, fertile soil of the ancient Americas. Long before the first European ships would scar the horizon of the Atlantic, a plant with broad velvety leaves and delicate trumpet-shaped flowers was already deeply woven into the spiritual and social fabric of the continent's first peoples. This plant, belonging to the genus Nicotiana, was what we now call tobacco. Its origins stretch back thousands of years, first growing wild in the Andean regions of modern-day Peru and Ecuador. Archaeological evidence suggests that human beings began to cultivate and use the plant as far back as 8,000 years ago. But this was not agriculture for the sake of sustenance. Unlike corn, beans, and squash, the other great staples of the Americas, tobacco offered no calories, no nutrition for the body. Its value was of a different, more ethereal kind. It was a plant for the soul. For the diverse and myriad cultures of the pre-Columbian Americas, from the vast empires of the Maya and the Aztec to the nomadic tribes of the Great Plains, tobacco was, above all else, a sacred entity. It was considered a gift from the Creator, a holy herb with immense spiritual power. Its smoke was not a casual indulgence but a visible form of prayer, a fragrant medium that could carry a person's thoughts, wishes, and pleas from the physical world up to the realm of the gods and the spirits. The act of smoking was a profound ritual, a way to sanctify an oath, seal a peace treaty, or prepare the mind for a sacred ceremony. The methods of consumption were as varied as the cultures themselves. In the dense jungles of South America, shamans and priests would often ingest tobacco in liquid form, brewing a potent, dark tea from the leaves that could induce a deep, hallucinogenic trance. In this altered state of consciousness, they believed they could travel to the spirit world, diagnose illnesses, communicate with ancestors, and divine the future. The leaves were also ground into a fine powder or snuff and inhaled through bone or wooden tubes, a practice that delivered a swift and powerful dose of the plant's active ingredient, nicotine, directly to the bloodstream. In other regions, the leaves were rolled into thick, primitive cigars, wrapped in corn husks or palm leaves. But perhaps the most iconic and widespread method of use was the pipe. The pipe, often carved from a special red stone called catlinite, was itself a sacred object. It was a microcosm of the universe, with the bowl representing the earth, the stem representing the connection between earth and sky, and the smoke representing the spirit's journey. The communal act of smoking a pipe, passing it from person to person in a circle, was a powerful symbol of unity, trust, and shared purpose. When a peace pipe, or calumet, was smoked between two warring tribes, it was a solemn, binding contract witnessed by the Creator. To break such an oath was to invite spiritual disaster. Tobacco was also the cornerstone of indigenous medicine. It was a true panacea, a plant believed to possess a cure for a vast range of ailments. Healers would use it as an antiseptic, packing wounds with crushed leaves to prevent infection. It was used as a painkiller, chewed to relieve the agony of a toothache, or applied as a poultice to soothe the sting of an insect or the bite of a snake. It was believed that the smoke could purge the body of disease and evil spirits, and it was often blown over a sick person in a healing ritual. The plant's power was so revered that it played a central role in mythology and cosmology. For many tribes, tobacco was the very first plant that the Creator gave to humanity, a special tool to facilitate communication between the mortal and the divine. Its cultivation was often surrounded by strict rituals and taboos. In some cultures, only men were allowed to grow it, and they had to purify themselves through fasting and prayer before planting the seeds. The harvest was a time of communal celebration and thanksgiving. It is crucial to understand that in this pre-Columbian world, tobacco was not associated with the kind of habitual, addictive, recreational use that we know today. Its power demanded respect. It was used intentionally, often sparingly, and almost always within a structured ceremonial context. The idea of smoking alone, simply for pleasure, would have been a foreign and perhaps sacrilegious concept. The plant was a spiritual tool, not a personal habit. This deep, ancient, and reverent relationship between humanity and the tobacco plant would exist in splendid isolation for thousands of years, a sacred pact unknown to the rest of the world. But that world was about to change, utterly and forever. Across the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, new ships with new men were setting sail, driven by a lust for gold and a zeal for God, completely unaware that one of the most valuable treasures they would find was not a precious metal, but a simple, dried leaf. Chapter 2. The Encounter, Columbus and the Dry Leaves. The year is 1492. 3 small Spanish ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, under the command of a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, have just made landfall on an island in what is now the Bahamas. They have stumbled, unknowingly, upon a new world. As Columbus and his men explored the island, they encountered the indigenous Taino people. The cultural exchange that followed was one of mutual astonishment and misunderstanding. The Spanish were captivated by the natives' gold ornaments, while the Taino were fascinated by the Europeans' metal tools and trinkets. In the midst of this exchange, Columbus noted in his journal that the natives brought them gifts of fruit, wooden spears, and something he described as certain dry leaves which gave off a distinct fragrance. To the Spanish, obsessed with finding the fabled riches of the East, these dried leaves seemed worthless. They were unceremoniously thrown away. It was a small, seemingly insignificant moment, but it was the first recorded encounter between Europe and the tobacco plant. A few weeks later, while sailing along the coast of Cuba, Columbus sent two of his crewmen, Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres, on an exploratory mission inland. When they returned, they reported seeing the natives performing a strange and remarkable ritual. They carried a burning firebrand made of herbs rolled up in a dried leaf, and would drink the smoke thereof. They would light one end and put the other in their mouths, periodically inhaling and then puffing the smoke out through their mouths and noses. The Spanish had no word for this practice, but the Taíno called the cylindrical roll of leaves a tabaco, a word the Spanish would later misapply to the plant itself. Rodrigo de Jerez, intrigued by the custom, tried it for himself. He found the experience pleasant and soon picked up the habit, becoming the first recorded European smoker. When he eventually returned to his hometown of Ayamonte in Spain, he continued to indulge in his new pastime, publicly puffing smoke from his mouth and nose. The effect on his neighbors was not one of curiosity, but of sheer terror. In a deeply religious society, a man who could voluntarily emit smoke from his own body was seen as being possessed by the devil. The local authorities of the Spanish Inquisition were summoned, and Jerez was arrested for his satanic behavior. He was imprisoned for 7 years, a punishment for what was considered a demonic act. By the time he was finally released, the very habit for which he had been condemned was rapidly spreading throughout the port cities of Spain and Portugal. The slow, inexorable European adoption of tobacco had begun, not through any formal process of trade or royal decree, but through the informal person-to-person contact of sailors and adventurers. These men, living rough lives far from home, were the first Europeans to spend significant time among the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They witnessed the natives' use of tobacco for ritual, for medicine, and for pleasure. Away from the strictures of the Inquisition, they were more open to experimentation. They found that smoking could relieve the boredom and hardship of long sea voyages, that it seemed to ward off hunger and fatigue, and that it provided a sense of comfort and camaraderie. As these sailors returned to ports like Seville, Lisbon, and later Bristol and Amsterdam, they brought the habit and the leaves themselves back with them. In the rough taverns and dockside neighborhoods of these bustling cities, the practice of smoking began to take root. It was, at first, a low-class, exotic curiosity, the strange custom of mariners who had been to the mysterious New World. It was viewed with a mixture of suspicion and fascination by the wider population. The plant itself began to arrive in Europe not as a valuable commodity, but as a botanical oddity. Seeds were brought back by explorers and missionaries, and the plant was cultivated in botanical gardens in Spain and Portugal as a strange and beautiful ornamental, prized for its tall stature and its elegant, sweet-smelling flowers. No one yet understood its economic potential. No one could have possibly imagined the profound and transformative impact that this humble American plant, these worthless dry leaves, would soon have on the culture, economy, and health of the entire globe. The initial encounter was over. The seed had been planted, both literally and figuratively, on European soil. The next phase of tobacco's journey would see it move from a sailor's vice and a gardener's curiosity to the center of a heated debate, where it would be hailed as both a divine miracle cure and a foul invention of the devil. The battle for the soul of the plant had begun. Chapter 3. Europe's First Embrace, Panacea and Poison. As the 16th century progressed, the tobacco plant began its slow migration from the botanical gardens and sailors' taverns into the heart of European society. Its journey was propelled by one of the most powerful forces of the age, the quest for new and miraculous medicines. This was a time when the medical arts were a blend of ancient Greek theory, herbal folklore, and religious superstition. Plagues and diseases swept through the population with terrifying regularity, and doctors had few effective remedies. In this atmosphere of medical uncertainty, a new and exotic plant from the Americas, one that was used as a panacea by its native peoples, was bound to attract intense interest. The man most famously associated with this transformation of tobacco from curiosity to cure was a French diplomat named Jean Nicot. In 1560, while serving as the French ambassador to the royal court in Lisbon, Portugal, Nicot became intrigued by the tobacco plant being grown in the palace gardens. He heard tales from the colonists of its incredible medicinal properties. He decided to experiment with it himself, creating a poultice from the crushed leaves and applying it to a cancerous tumor on the face of an acquaintance. According to the story, the tumor was miraculously cured. Emboldened by this success, Nicot sent some tobacco seeds and a letter detailing its virtues back to the French royal court, specifically to the powerful Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici. The Queen was suffering from severe and persistent migraine headaches. Nicot recommended that she grind the dried tobacco leaves into a fine powder and inhale it through her nose. She tried the remedy, and to her astonishment her headaches vanished. The Queen was so delighted with this new wonder drug that she declared it the Queen's herb, or herba regina. Her enthusiastic royal endorsement made the practice of using tobacco, particularly in the form of snuff, instantly fashionable and respectable among the French aristocracy. The plant itself was for a time known as Nicotiana, in honor of Jean Nicot, a name that would later be immortalized in the scientific classification of the genus, Nicotiana, and in the name of its primary active alkaloid, nicotine. With this royal seal of approval, the reputation of tobacco as a miracle cure exploded across Europe. Physicians and herbalists began to promote it with an almost religious fervor. It was hailed as the holy herb, God's remedy, and a universal antidote to all poisons. Medical texts and herbals of the era attributed an astonishing list of curative powers to the plant. It was prescribed for everything from asthma, coughs and colds, to arthritis, gout, and epilepsy. It was believed to cure ulcers, sores, and skin diseases. It was used to treat intestinal worms, to ward off the plague, and to revive drowning victims by blowing the smoke into their lungs, or, more commonly, their rectums, using a special bellows. No ailment seemed beyond its reach. Its smoke was seen as a powerful fumigant that could purify the air and protect against pestilence. In the Great Plague of London in 1665, it was widely believed that tobacco smokers were less likely to contract the disease, and schoolboys at Eton were reportedly ordered to smoke a pipe each morning as a protective measure. But even as tobacco was being celebrated as a divine panacea, a powerful and vocal backlash was already forming. From the very beginning, the practice of smoking, in particular, was viewed by many as a strange, unnatural, and morally suspect habit. The most prominent and influential of these early anti-tobacco crusaders was King James I of England. In 1604, long before he authorized the famous translation of the Bible that bears his name, King James published an anonymous but widely read pamphlet entitled A Counterblast to Tobacco. It was a furious, passionate, and deeply personal attack on the practice of smoking. The king loathed the habit, which he had seen grow in popularity at his court, particularly after the return of Sir Walter Raleigh from the Americas. In his counterblast, James attacked smoking on multiple grounds. He argued that it was a savage and barbaric custom, unbecoming of a civilized Englishman. He ridiculed the supposed medicinal benefits, pointing out the absurdity of using the same cure for a wide variety of contradictory diseases. He argued that it was a wasteful and extravagant habit, draining the wealth of his subjects who spent their money on a fleeting puff of smoke. But his most powerful arguments were moral and physiological. He described the smell of the smoke as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. In a passage of remarkable prescience, he likened the inside of a chronic smoker's body to a sooty kitchen. He also condemned it as a form of idleness and a gateway to other vices. Finally, he connected it to divine wrath, suggesting that Englishmen were angering God by imitating the customs of wild, godless, and slavish Indians. To discourage the habit, King James imposed a massive 4,000% tax increase on tobacco imports, one of the first sin taxes in history. But his efforts were in vain. The demand for tobacco was already too strong. His subjects were willing to pay the exorbitant prices, and smugglers were happy to bypass the tax. The king's counterblast failed to stop the spread of smoking, but it perfectly framed the debate that would rage around tobacco for the next 4 centuries. Was it a sophisticated pleasure and a medical marvel, or a foul, dangerous, and addictive poison? Europe was now deeply divided. The plant from the New World had taken root, and it was already revealing its profoundly dualistic nature, a source of both pleasure and controversy, profit and peril. Chapter 4. The Colonial Engine, Tobacco, and the Making of America. While the courts and coffee houses of Europe debated the merits and morals of tobacco, across the Atlantic, the plant was beginning to play a far more consequential role. It was becoming the economic engine of a new colonial empire, and in the process, it would lay the foundations for the future United States of America and create a deep and tragic dependence on the institution of human slavery. The story of this transformation begins in the struggling English colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Founded in 1607, the settlement was, for its first decade, an unmitigated disaster. The colonists, many of them gentlemen adventurers with no farming experience, were ill-prepared for the harsh realities of the New World. They were plagued by disease, starvation, and violent conflicts with the native Powhatan Confederacy. The colony was on the brink of collapse, a failed investment for the Virginia Company of London, which had financed it. The settlers had found no gold or silver, and they had no valuable commodity to export back to England to justify their existence. That all changed in 1612 with the arrival of a colonist named John Rolfe. Rolfe was an enterprising young man who saw the growing demand for tobacco in London and realized that Virginia's climate and soil were perfectly suited for its cultivation. The local tobacco used by the Powhatan, Nicotiana rustica, was considered too harsh and bitter for European tastes. Rolfe, in an act of what would now be called industrial espionage, managed to obtain seeds of a sweeter, more palatable strain of tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum, which was being grown in the Spanish colonies of the Caribbean. He began experimenting with cultivating and curing these new leaves, and the result was a product that was an instant sensation in the English market. The first shipment of Rolfe's Virginia tobacco arrived in London in 1614, and it fetched an incredibly high price. Suddenly, the Jamestown colony had its cash crop, its brown gold. The discovery transformed the colony overnight. The desperate search for precious metals was abandoned, and the colonists threw themselves into tobacco cultivation with a frenzied, single-minded obsession. The streets and marketplaces of Jamestown itself were plowed over and planted with tobacco. The lure of instant wealth created a massive tobacco boom. A man could make a small fortune in a single season. This new economic reality fundamentally shaped the development of Virginia and the surrounding colonies. The cultivation of tobacco is an intensely labor-intensive process. It requires constant attention from planting the tiny seeds in seed beds to transplanting the seedlings into the fields to the back-breaking work of weeding, topping the plants to encourage leaf growth, and removing hornworms by hand. The harvest was equally arduous, followed by the complex and skillful process of curing the leaves in specially built tobacco barns. To produce tobacco on a commercial scale required a large and disciplined workforce. At first, the Virginia Company met this demand through the system of indentured servitude. Poor and landless people from England would sign a contract, an indenture, agreeing to work for a master in Virginia for a set period, typically 4 to 7 years. In exchange, they would receive passage to America, food, lodging, and, at the end of their term, a small plot of land and some tools, their freedom dues. For a few decades, this system provided the labor that fueled the tobacco boom. But as the demand for tobacco grew and the great plantations began to expand along the rivers of the Chesapeake Bay, the system of indentured servitude began to break down. There were not enough English workers willing to sign up, and those who completed their service became free competitors. The plantation owners, the wealthy elite of the colony, needed a cheaper, more permanent, and more easily controlled source of labor. They found it in the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought by a Dutch ship. Their initial status was ambiguous, and some may have been treated as indentured servants. But as the 17th century progressed, the colonial legislatures controlled by the planter class began to pass a series of laws that systematically stripped away the rights of people of African descent and codified a new, brutal system of permanent, hereditary, race-based chattel slavery. These laws were driven, above all else, by the economics of tobacco. Slavery was the institution that made the large-scale plantation system profitable. The immense wealth of the Virginia aristocracy, the fortunes of the men who would later become the founding fathers of the United States, like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were built on the foundation of profits derived from tobacco cultivated by the labor of enslaved Africans. The plant that had once been a symbol of peace and spiritual connection in its native land had become, in the hands of European colonists, inextricably linked to a system of brutal exploitation and profound human suffering. It had saved the colony of Virginia, but in doing so it had embedded the poison of slavery deep into the soul of the new American society, a poison whose legacy would endure for centuries to come. The sacred herb had become a colonial commodity, and its smoke now carried not the scent of prayer, but the bitter aroma of bondage. Chapter 5. The Age of the Snuff-Box, an Aristocratic Habit. While tobacco was creating a new, plantation-based society in the Americas, its role in Europe was undergoing a parallel evolution. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the primary mode of tobacco consumption among the European elite shifted dramatically. The rough and boisterous habit of pipe smoking, with its clouds of acrid smoke, began to be seen as coarse and common, suitable for sailors and laborers but not for the refined sensibilities of the aristocracy. In the perfumed drawing rooms, glittering ballrooms, and meticulously manicured gardens of the great European courts, a new, more elegant, and far more discreet method of taking tobacco reigned supreme. Snuff. Snuff is a fine, dry powder made from specially cured and fermented tobacco leaves, often scented with a variety of delicate aromas like lavender, rose, bergamot, or clove. A small pinch of this powder, a pinch of snuff, is taken from a small box and either placed on the back of the hand or between the thumb and forefinger, and then gently sniffed up into the nostrils. The nicotine is absorbed rapidly through the mucous membranes, delivering a quick and stimulating effect without any of the fire or smoke associated with the pipe. The practice had existed for centuries, but in the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, it was elevated to a high art form, a complex social ritual that became an indispensable part of aristocratic life. The epicenter of this new fashion was the French court at Versailles. Under the rule of kings like Louis XIV and Louis XV, the French court set the standard for elegance and sophistication throughout Europe. And at court, the taking of snuff was not merely a habit, it was a performance. There was a precise and elaborate etiquette that governed every aspect of the ritual. A gentleman would first produce his snuff-box from his waistcoat pocket. He would then tap it gently, a specific number of times with his finger. He would open the lid with a flourish, offer a pinch to his companions, and then take one for himself with a graceful, practiced gesture of the hand. Every movement was scrutinized and judged. A clumsy or indelicate gesture could mark a man as a provincial boor, while a perfectly executed performance was a sign of good breeding, refinement, and a man of the world. The snuff-box itself became a crucial fashion accessory, a primary vehicle for displaying one's wealth, status, and taste. These were not simple containers. They were exquisite works of art, miniature masterpieces crafted from the most precious materials available. They were made of gold and silver, encrusted with diamonds, rubies, and pearls. They were fashioned from mother-of-pearl, tortoise-shell, ivory, and exotic hardwoods. They were often decorated with intricate enamel work, featuring miniature portraits of loved ones, pastoral landscapes, or scenes from classical mythology. A nobleman might own hundreds of snuff-boxes, one for every occasion and every outfit. The exchange of snuff-boxes was a common royal and diplomatic gift, a symbol of favor and esteem. Frederick the Great of Prussia was said to have owned a collection of over 1/500, while Napoleon Bonaparte was a prodigious user of snuff. carrying a large leather-lined box with him even on his military campaigns. The habit of snuff-taking spread from the French court to every corner of elite European society. In England, famous figures like the writer Alexander Pope and the politician Charles James Fox were devoted snuff-takers. In the newly established United States, the wives of the early presidents, like Martha Washington and Dolly Madison, were known to enjoy a pinch of snuff. The popularity of the habit created a massive industry. Entire regions, particularly in the American colonies of Virginia and Maryland, specialized in growing the specific types of dark-fired tobacco that were best suited for making snuff. The leaves were shipped to Europe, where they were processed in large factories, called snuff mills, which ground the fermented leaves into a fine powder. Different brands of snuff, with their own proprietary scents and textures, competed for the loyalty of discerning customers. The age of the snuff box was the peak of tobacco's social respectability. It had shed its association with sailors and savages, and had become the chosen indulgence of kings, queens, philosophers, and poets. It was a symbol of the rational, ordered, and elegant world of the Enlightenment. However, even this refined habit had its detractors. Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, satirized the practice. And for all its elegance, it was not a particularly clean habit. The fine brown powder would often stain the user's upper lip and fingers, and the inevitable sneezes that followed a pinch could be disruptive. But for over a century, snuff was a dominant form of tobacco use in the Western world. Its quiet, powdered reign would only begin to fade in the early 19th century, with the rise of a new, more romantic, and far more overtly masculine way of consuming the leaf: the cigar. Chapter 6. The Cigar's Ascent, Revolution, and Romance. As the 18th century drew to a close, the powdered wigs, silk stockings, and delicate snuff boxes of the old aristocratic order were swept away by the tides of revolution and war that convulsed Europe. The French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, from 1792 to 1815, not only redrew the political map of the continent, but also profoundly changed its social customs and cultural tastes. In the wake of this tumultuous period, a new and more robust symbol of masculinity and power emerged in the world of tobacco: the cigar. The cigar, a tightly rolled bundle of dried and fermented tobacco leaves, was not a new invention. It had been smoked by the indigenous peoples of the Americas for centuries. The Spanish had adopted the habit in their colonies, particularly in Cuba, where the combination of rich soil and a perfect climate produced tobacco leaves of unparalleled quality. The Spanish word cigarro likely derives from the Mayan word sicar, meaning to smoke. For centuries, cigar smoking had been largely confined to Spain and its colonies. But the Napoleonic Wars changed everything. British and French soldiers fighting in the Peninsular War in Spain were exposed to the local custom of smoking cigars. They found that these cigars were a perfect soldier's smoke. They were portable, easy to light, and provided a long-lasting and deeply satisfying experience. When these soldiers returned home to Britain and France after the war, they brought the habit with them. The cigar quickly began to supplant the pipe and the snuff box as the preferred form of tobacco for the fashionable man. This rise in popularity coincided with the cultural movement known as Romanticism, which celebrated individualism, emotion, and a certain rugged, contemplative masculinity. The cigar fit this new mood perfectly. Unlike the quick, furtive pinch of snuff, smoking a cigar was a deliberate and time-consuming act. It encouraged quiet contemplation and deep conversation. It became a symbol not of frivolous, courtly manners, but of serious, worldly power. The cigar was the smoke of the new titans of the 19th century, the industrialists, the bankers, the politicians, and the generals. It was associated with wealth, success, and a certain confident, patriarchal authority. The image of a man in a frock coat, leaning back in a leather armchair in a smoke-filled private club, a glass of brandy in one hand and a thick, smoldering cigar in the other, became a defining cliché of the Victorian era. The finest cigars in the world came from Havana, Cuba. The island became a legendary name among connoisseurs, and brands like Partagais, H. Upmann, and Punch became synonymous with luxury and quality. The process of making a fine Havana cigar was, and still is, a highly skilled craft, with the tobacco leaves being carefully selected, aged, blended, and then expertly hand-rolled by trained artisans, or torcedores. The cigar also became a favorite of writers and intellectuals. Mark Twain, the great American humorist, was rarely seen without a cigar and claimed to smoke over 20 a day. He once famously quipped, "If I cannot smoke cigars in heaven, I shall not go." Rudyard Kipling penned a poem in praise of the cigar, and Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, was a devoted cigar smoker, a habit that would ultimately contribute to the jaw cancer that afflicted him for the last 16 years of his life. In the United States, the cigar became a powerful political symbol. The smoke-filled room, a place where powerful men made political deals outside of the public eye, became a part of the American political lexicon. The cigar was also a symbol of military leadership. Ulysses S. Grant, the victorious Union general in the American Civil War, and later President of the United States, was a famous and prodigious cigar smoker, a habit he picked up during the stress of battle. After a particularly important victory, he was inundated with gift boxes of cigars from a grateful public, and he was rarely photographed without one. While the cigar projected an image of power and luxury, its production was often based on harsh labor conditions. The tobacco fields of Cuba and the cigar factories of Havana and later of Tampa, Florida, were staffed by low-paid workers who toiled for long hours in difficult conditions. These factories also became hotbeds of intellectual and political activity, as lectors were often hired to read newspapers, political pamphlets, and classic literature aloud to the workers as they rolled, contributing to a highly literate and politically engaged workforce that would play a key role in the Cuban independence movement. The reign of the cigar lasted for much of the 19th century. It was the undisputed symbol of male power and contemplative leisure. But even as it reached the peak of its prestige, a new and far more revolutionary form of tobacco was quietly waiting in the wings. It was smaller, cheaper, quicker, and infinitely more accessible. It was the cigarette, and its arrival would democratize smoking and unleash the addictive power of nicotine on a scale the world had never before seen. Chapter 7. The Cigarette is Born, a Democratic Smoke. The cigar was the smoke of the powerful and the privileged, a luxury item that required both time and money to enjoy. The pipe was the smoke of the working man and the rustic farmer, but it was the cigarette that would ultimately conquer the world. breaking down all barriers of class and wealth to become the most successful and deadly consumer product in human history. The origins of the cigarette are humble and somewhat obscure. The practice of wrapping a small amount of chopped tobacco in a thin piece of paper or a corn husk had existed for centuries, a cheap and simple way for the poor to enjoy a quick smoke. It was known in Spain as a papelate. But the modern cigarette as we know it was born on the battlefields of the 19th century. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, British soldiers once again found themselves fighting alongside allies with different smoking customs. They observed their French and Turkish comrades smoking these small, paper-wrapped cigarettes, the French diminutive for cigar. They were quick to light, could be smoked in just a few minutes during a break in the fighting, and were easy to carry. The British soldiers brought the habit home with them after the war, and the first cigarette factories began to appear in England. For several decades, however, cigarettes remained a niche product. They were more expensive than pipe tobacco and were often seen as slightly effeminate or foreign compared to the robust cigar. A key part of the expense was the fact that they had to be rolled by hand, a slow and painstaking process. A skilled cigarette roller could produce perhaps 4 or 5 a minute. This all changed with a single game-changing invention. In 1880, a young man from Virginia named James Bonsack invented a machine that could automate the entire process of cigarette manufacturing. His ingenious device could take a continuous roll of paper, feed in a steady stream of tobacco, glue the paper, and cut off perfectly formed cigarettes at a speed that was almost unimaginable. His first prototype could produce 200 cigarettes a minute, a rate that would soon be increased to thousands a minute. Bonsack's machine had the potential to utterly transform the tobacco industry, to make cigarettes so cheap that they could be afforded by absolutely everyone. But when he first tried to sell his invention to the major cigarette manufacturers of the day, they were surprisingly uninterested. They were comfortable with their small, high-end market and were skeptical that there was a mass market for a pre-rolled product. One man, however, saw the revolutionary potential of Bonsack's machine. His name was James Buchanan Duke, known as Buck. Duke was a young, aggressive, and ruthlessly ambitious tobacco entrepreneur from North Carolina. His family had started a small tobacco business after the Civil War, and Buck was determined to turn it into a national powerhouse. He understood something that his more conservative competitors did not. The key to success was not in catering to a small, existing market, but in creating a massive, new one. In 1884, he took a huge gamble and leased Bonsack's machines, eventually securing an exclusive contract for their use. Duke's factory in Durham, North Carolina, began churning out cigarettes at a phenomenal rate, far faster than he could sell them. He was faced with a classic industrial problem. His production capacity had suddenly outstripped consumer demand. He realized that to succeed, he would not just have to manufacture cigarettes, he would have to manufacture smokers. And so, Buck Duke embarked on a marketing and advertising campaign of unprecedented scale and ingenuity. A campaign that would not only make him one of the richest men in America, but would also pioneer the techniques of modern mass marketing. He poured millions of dollars into advertising. He plastered the names of his brands, like Duke of Durham and Cameo, on billboards, in newspapers, and on the sides of barns across the country. He used celebrity endorsements, particularly from popular actresses and athletes. He sponsored racing events and offered prizes for all sorts of competitions. One of his most brilliant innovations was the inclusion of stiffener cards in each pack of cigarettes to protect them from being crushed. He soon realized he could print pictures on these cards. This led to the creation of the first collectible trading cards, featuring images of famous actresses, military heroes, flags of all nations, and, most popular of all, baseball players. This created a craze among boys and young men who would buy pack after pack of cigarettes just to complete their card collections, starting them on a lifelong habit in the process. Duke's aggressive tactics worked. Cigarette consumption in the United States skyrocketed. By 1890, his company, the American Tobacco Company, had absorbed most of its competitors and controlled 90% of the American cigarette market. A near-total monopoly that would eventually be broken up by the Supreme Court for violating antitrust laws. The Bonsack machine had made the cigarette cheap, and Buck Duke's marketing had made it desirable. The cigarette was no longer a foreign novelty. It was an American product, a symbol of the modern, industrial, fast-paced world. It was the democratic smoke, available to the factory worker and the farmhand, the clerk and the soldier. Its rise to dominance was complete, and with its rise came a new, more intense, and more insidious form of nicotine addiction. Unlike pipes or cigars, the smoke from which is generally not inhaled deeply, the milder smoke of the modern, bright leaf tobacco cigarette was easily inhaled deep into the lungs. This delivered nicotine to the brain with incredible speed and efficiency, making the cigarette a far more addictive product than any form of tobacco that had come before it. The stage was set for the 20th century, the century of the cigarette, and the century of the smoker. Chapter 8. The Power of the Brand, Marketing and Addiction. With the cigarette now established as a cheap and ubiquitous mass-market product, the tobacco industry entered a new phase. Buck Duke's American Tobacco Company monopoly was broken up by the government in 1911, leading to the creation of several large competing firms, including R.J. Reynolds, Liggett and Myers, and Lorillard. This new competitive landscape sparked an advertising arms race, a battle for the hearts, minds, and lungs of the American public. The challenge for these companies was that all cigarettes were, essentially, the same product. They were all just chopped tobacco rolled in paper. To succeed, a company had to create a sense of distinction and loyalty where none intrinsically existed. They had to sell not just a product, but an image, an identity, a story. In short, they had to create the power of the brand. This period, from the 1910s to the 1930s, was the golden age of cigarette advertising, a time when the industry perfected the art of psychological manipulation and created a cultural landscape saturated with its messages. One of the most successful early brands was Camel, launched by R.J. Reynolds in 1913. Camels were one of the first brands to use a blend of different tobaccos, including Turkish tobacco, which gave them a distinctive flavor and aroma. But their success was driven by a brilliant marketing campaign. The campaign began with a series of cryptic teaser ads in newspapers across the country. The first ads simply said, "The camels are coming." This was followed by ads showing pictures of camels, and finally the full ad was revealed, showing a pack of Camel cigarettes with its now iconic image of a dromedary camel. The campaign created a massive buzz, and Camels quickly became the best-selling cigarette in the country. The advertising of this era focused on creating powerful associations. Cigarette brands were linked to whatever was most desirable in the culture at the time. They were associated with modernity and progress, with ads featuring airplanes, skyscrapers, and fast cars. They were linked to success and sophistication, with well-dressed men in elegant settings enjoying a smoke. And they were, above all, linked to masculinity. Ads depicted rugged, adventurous men, cowboys, soldiers, sailors, and explorers, all of whom smoked a particular brand. The message was clear: real men smoke. The industry also pioneered the use of celebrity endorsements. Baseball stars like Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb, actors and famous singers all lent their images to cigarette ads, testifying to how their chosen brand helped them perform better or calmed their nerves. Perhaps the most cynical and effective marketing tactic was the use of health claims. In an era before significant medical evidence to the contrary, cigarette companies were free to make all sorts of unsubstantiated claims about the benefits of their products. Ads for Camels told consumers that doctors smoked Camels more than any other cigarette. Lucky Strike ads claimed their tobacco was toasted, a process they claimed removed harmful irritants and made the smoke smoother on the throat. Ads for Old Gold claimed their cigarettes would help you avoid a cough. These campaigns were designed to both reassure existing smokers and to subtly suggest that smoking could actually be good for you. The competition between brands was fierce and often personal. The legendary advertising executive Albert Lasker, working for the American Tobacco Company's Lucky Strike brand, launched a campaign with the slogan, "It's Toasted," directly attacking the competition by implying their tobacco was not. George Washington Hill, the notoriously aggressive president of the American Tobacco Company, would personally vet every ad, looking for the most effective psychological triggers. He understood that advertising was about repetition and emotional appeal, not rational argument. He famously told his ad men that their job was to create ads that were so annoying and intrusive that people couldn't get them out of their heads. The industry also invested heavily in new forms of media. As radio became a household fixture in the 1920s and 30s, the tobacco companies were among the biggest sponsors of programming. They sponsored news broadcasts, musical variety shows like the Lucky Strike Hit Parade, and dramatic serials. The jingles and slogans from these shows became a part of the national consciousness. Through this relentless, multi-pronged, and psychologically sophisticated marketing effort, the tobacco industry achieved a level of cultural saturation that is difficult to imagine today. They had successfully embedded their products into the very fabric of daily life. They had transformed a simple agricultural product into a powerful symbol of identity, and in the process, they had created a nation of loyal, addicted consumers. They had not just sold a product, they had sold a worldview, one in which smoking was a normal, natural, and desirable part of a successful and modern life. This carefully constructed reality would soon be put to the test in the crucible of global conflict, where the cigarette would find its most captive market yet, the soldier on the front lines. Chapter 9. Tobacco Goes to War, the Soldier's Companion. If the Bonsack machine democratized the cigarette and mass marketing made it desirable, it was the two great global conflicts of the 20th century that cemented its place as an indispensable part of modern life. World War I and World War II were the ultimate marketing campaigns for the tobacco industry, creating millions of new, dedicated smokers and forging a deep psychological link between smoking and the virtues of patriotism, courage, and camaraderie. When the First World War broke out in 1914, cigarettes were already popular, but the experience of the war would make them ubiquitous. Life in the trenches of the Western Front was a unique form of hell. It was a monotonous, terrifying existence, marked by long periods of boredom and punctuated by moments of extreme violence and horror. In this environment, the cigarette became a soldier's most faithful companion. A smoke was a small, treasured ritual in a world stripped of all other comforts. It was a way to pass the endless hours of waiting, to calm the nerves before going over the top into no man's land, and to forge a bond with the men who shared your trench and your fate. The act of sharing a cigarette or offering a light was a simple but powerful gesture of solidarity. The glow of a cigarette in the darkness was a small beacon of life in a landscape of death. Recognizing the crucial role that tobacco played in maintaining morale, military leaders and governments on all sides of the conflict made sure their soldiers were well supplied. Tobacco companies, eager to wrap their brands in the flag, launched tobacco funds and Smokes for Soldiers campaigns, encouraging civilians on the home front to donate money to send cigarettes to the troops. Respected public figures and even royalty lent their names to these campaigns. General John J. Blackjack Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, famously cabled Washington with the message, "You ask me what we need to win this war. I answer tobacco as much as bullets." Cigarettes were included as a standard part of a soldier's daily rations, alongside bread, meat, and ammunition. For millions of young men who may not have been regular smokers before the war, the Army effectively issued them the habit. They learned to smoke in the trenches, and when they returned home as veterans, they brought the habit and their brand loyalty back with them. The war transformed the cigarette from a simple consumer product into a patriotic necessity, a symbol of the nation's gratitude to its fighting men. This relationship between smoking and soldiering was even more pronounced during the Second World War. By 1941, the tobacco industry and the U.S. government had a well-established partnership. When the United States entered the war, the major tobacco companies eagerly pledged their support for the war effort. They sent millions of cigarettes to the troops overseas, free of charge. Brands like Lucky Strike, Camel, and Chesterfield were included in the soldiers' C ration and K ration kits. The company's advertising back home was relentlessly patriotic. Lucky Strike changed its iconic green and red pack to a white one, with the famous slogan, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war," claiming the green dye was needed for the war effort, though it was actually a marketing move to make the pack more appealing to women. Ads depicted handsome, smiling soldiers, sailors, and airmen enjoying their favorite cigarette, with captions like, "They've got what it takes," or "The favorite of the armed forces." The cigarette became an integral part of the iconography of the American GI. Famous war correspondents like Ernie Pyle wrote about the simple comfort a cigarette could provide to a weary, frightened soldier. Iconic photographs from every theater of the war, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, showed soldiers smoking. It was the first thing they did after a firefight, the last thing they did before trying to sleep. It was a currency in the prisoner of war camps, and a gesture of goodwill offered to liberated civilians. The war cemented the image of the smoker as a hero, a tough, resilient, and dependable man doing a difficult job. This cultural association was so powerful that it created an entire generation of smokers. By the end of the war, the per capita cigarette consumption in the United States had reached an all-time high. The tobacco industry had succeeded beyond its wildest dreams. It had linked its product not just to glamour and success, but to the very defense of freedom and democracy. The cigarette was no longer just a smoke. It was a symbol of an entire generation, the greatest generation, a habit forged in the fires of global conflict. But even as the industry celebrated its patriotic triumph, it was already preparing for its next great conquest, a new and untapped market that represented half of the population. Chapter 10. Torches of Freedom: How Tobacco Seduced Women. For most of its history, public smoking had been an exclusively male domain. While some women, particularly those in bohemian or theatrical circles, might smoke in private, for a respectable woman to smoke in public was a major social taboo. It was seen as a vulgar, unfeminine, and morally suspect act, associated with prostitutes and women of low repute. For the tobacco industry, this social barrier represented a massive untapped market. If they could break down this taboo and make smoking acceptable and even desirable for women, they could effectively double their customer base. In the 1920s, a decade of great social change and upheaval, they set out to do just that. With a campaign of psychological manipulation and public relations genius that would change the social landscape forever. The key figure in this story was not a tobacco executive, but a man who is often called the father of modern public relations, Edward Bernays. Bernays was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he was fascinated by his uncle's theories about the unconscious, irrational forces that drive human behavior. He believed that by understanding these hidden desires and anxieties, one could shape public opinion and engineer consent. He called this new field public relations. In the late 1920s, George Washington Hill, the head of the American Tobacco Company, hired Bernays for a specific and challenging task: to figure out how to sell Lucky Strike cigarettes to women. Bernays consulted with a leading psychoanalyst, who told him that for many women, cigarettes were a symbolic representation of male power and freedom. If Bernays could link smoking to the burgeoning feminist movement and the fight for women's rights, he could turn the cigarette into a powerful symbol of female empowerment. This insight led to one of the most famous public relations stunts in history. Bernays decided to stage a dramatic public event during the 1929 Easter Sunday parade on Fifth Avenue in New York City, one of the most visible and well-covered events of the year. He hired a group of fashionable young women, including a debutante, to march in the parade. At a prearranged signal, these women would stop, dramatically pull out hidden Lucky Strike cigarettes, and light them up in unison, right in front of the assembled press photographers. Bernays had alerted the media beforehand that a group of suffragettes were planning to protest by lighting what they called torches of freedom. The phrase was a brilliant piece of psychological framing. It transformed a simple act of smoking into a political statement, a gesture of rebellion against male-dominated social norms. The event was a massive media sensation. The next day, newspapers across the country ran photographs of the beautiful, defiant young women lighting their torches of freedom. The campaign was a stunning success. It didn't just make it acceptable for women to smoke in public. It made it fashionable, glamorous, and politically chic. This PR stunt was just the beginning. The tobacco industry followed up with a wave of advertising aimed directly at women. They placed ads in women's magazines, featuring elegant, sophisticated women enjoying a cigarette in fashionable settings. They hired famous actresses like Marlene Dietrich and Joan Crawford, icons of Hollywood glamour, to endorse their brands. They developed new marketing angles specifically tailored to female anxieties and aspirations. One of the most insidious and effective of these was the campaign that linked smoking to slimness. In an era when a slender figure was becoming the ideal of female beauty, Lucky Strike launched a campaign with the slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet." The ads suggested that smoking was a way to control one's appetite and maintain a fashionable, slender figure. The message was clear. Smoking makes you thin and beautiful. The industry also began to focus on the aesthetics of the cigarette itself. They offered cigarettes with ivory or cork tips to prevent the paper from sticking to a woman's lipstick. They even experimented with colored cigarettes designed to match a woman's outfit. The results of these concerted efforts were dramatic. Female smoking rates, which had been in the single digits before the 1920s, began to climb steadily. By the end of the World War II, nearly a third of American women were smokers. The tobacco industry had successfully conquered its new frontier. By co-opting the language of liberation and preying on insecurities about beauty and weight, they had recruited millions of women into the ranks of addicted smokers. The torches of freedom had, in reality, become torches of addiction. A tragic irony that would only become fully apparent decades later, when the rates of lung cancer and other smoking-related diseases among women began to soar. Chapter 11. The Golden Age of Smoke, a Clouded Culture. The period from the end of World War II in 1945 to the early 1960s can be seen as the absolute zenith of tobacco's power and cultural acceptance. This was the golden age of smoke, a time when the cigarette was not just a product, but an omnipresent and unquestioned feature of daily life in the Western world. To look back at the popular culture of this era is to enter a world shrouded in a permanent blue-gray haze. Cigarette smoking was everywhere, practiced by everyone in almost every conceivable location. In the movies, the biggest stars of the silver screen, from Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall in film noir classics to the suave Cary Grant and the elegant Audrey Hepburn, were rarely seen without a cigarette. The act of lighting a cigarette, of inhaling deeply and exhaling a stream of smoke, was a key part of their on-screen persona. A gesture used to convey coolness, sophistication, contemplation, or defiance. The cigarette was an essential prop, a piece of cinematic language that everyone understood. The new medium of television, which exploded in popularity in the 1950s, brought smoking directly into the American living room. Beloved sitcom stars like Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz smoked openly on their show, I Love Lucy, which was sponsored by Philip Morris. News anchors like the trusted Edward R. Murrow conducted their interviews through a thick cloud of smoke. Even children's shows, like The Flintstones, were initially sponsored by Winston Cigarettes, featuring cartoon characters Fred and Barney enjoying a smoke during the commercial breaks. The normalization of smoking was not limited to the screen. It was an integral part of the real world as well. People smoked in their offices, with ashtrays becoming standard desk equipment. They smoked in restaurants, on buses, on trains, and on airplanes, where the cabin would often be thick with smoke by the end of a flight. They smoked in hospital waiting rooms and even in doctors' offices. The medical profession, which would later lead the charge against tobacco, was at this time deeply complicit in its promotion. For decades, the most popular and trusted form of cigarette advertising was the doctor endorsement. Ads in major magazines and on billboards featured handsome, reassuring-looking men in white coats, holding a cigarette and offering pseudoscientific endorsements. The most famous of these was the campaign for Camel cigarettes, which ran for years with the slogan, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." The claim was based on flimsy surveys conducted by the tobacco company itself, where doctors were given free cartons of Camels and then asked what brand they smoked. The ads were a masterpiece of misdirection, creating the powerful and entirely false impression that the medical community had studied the issue and had given smoking, and specifically the Camel brand, its seal of approval. This cultural saturation meant that, for a young person coming of age in the 1950s, the decision to start smoking was almost not a decision at all. It was simply a rite of passage, a normal step on the path to adulthood. It was what your parents did, what your teachers did, what your heroes on the screen did. Not to smoke was to be an outsider, to be different. The social pressure was immense. The result was the highest smoking rates in history. In countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, roughly half of all adults were regular smokers, with the rates among men being significantly higher, approaching 70 or 80% in some demographics. The tobacco industry was at the peak of its profitability and its political power. Its executives were celebrated as captains of industry, and the companies were blue-chip stocks, seen as safe and reliable investments. It seemed as though the reign of King Tobacco was unassailable. The world was wreathed in its smoke, and the vast majority of the population was either unaware of the dangers or had been lulled into a false sense of security by the industry's relentless marketing and reassuring pseudoscience. But beneath this clouded surface of cultural acceptance, a quiet and methodical revolution was beginning. In the hushed laboratories and statistical departments of universities and research institutes, a small number of scientists were beginning to connect the dots, compiling data that would soon lead to a shocking and undeniable conclusion. The cigarette, the beloved companion of a generation, was a killer on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. The golden age of smoke was about to come to a devastating end. Chapter 12. The Unseen Killer, the Scientific Reckoning. While the culture was celebrating the cigarette, a small but growing number of doctors and scientists were beginning to observe a frightening new trend. A disease that had once been a medical rarity, lung cancer, was appearing with alarming frequency. In the early 20th century, a doctor might go their entire career without seeing a single case. By the 1940s, it was becoming a common diagnosis, and by the 1950s, it was an epidemic. Some researchers began to suspect a link between this dramatic increase and the parallel explosion in cigarette smoking, but proving such a link was incredibly difficult. The tobacco industry, with its vast resources, argued that the connection was merely statistical and that no causal link had been proven. They suggested that the rise in lung cancer could be due to other factors, like air pollution from cars and factories. The scientific community needed definitive, large-scale evidence to counter this narrative. That evidence began to emerge from two landmark epidemiological studies, one in the United Kingdom and one in the United States, which would change the course of public health forever. In Great Britain, two researchers, Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill, launched the British Doctors Study in 1951. They chose to study doctors for a simple reason. They were a large, well-documented group of professionals whose health and habits could be tracked accurately over a long period. They sent a questionnaire to nearly 40,000 male doctors across the UK, asking them about their smoking habits. Then they simply waited and watched. Over the coming years, they tracked the mortality rates and causes of death for the doctors in their study. The results, first published in 1954 and confirmed with even greater certainty in subsequent reports, were shocking and unequivocal. There was a direct, powerful, and dose-dependent relationship between the number of cigarettes a doctor smoked and his likelihood of dying from lung cancer. Heavy smokers were more than 20 times more likely to die of the disease than non-smokers. The study also found strong links between smoking and other diseases, particularly coronary heart disease. The evidence was overwhelming. Dahl himself, who had been a smoker, quit the habit immediately after seeing the preliminary results. At the same time, a similar, even larger study was being conducted in the United States by E. Kyler Hammond and Daniel Horn for the American Cancer Society. The Hammond-Horn study was a massive undertaking, enrolling over 187,000 men between the ages of 50 and 69. Volunteers from the American Cancer Society helped to track the participants over several years. The results, published in 1954 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, perfectly mirrored the findings of the British study. They found a staggeringly high death rate among cigarette smokers compared to non-smokers, with lung cancer being the most dramatically increased risk. The scientific method of epidemiology, which studies the patterns and causes of disease in populations, had provided the smoking gun. These studies were so large, so well designed, and their results so clear that they could no longer be dismissed as mere coincidence. The scientific evidence was now on the table, but scientific evidence alone is often not enough to change the world. It had to be translated into public knowledge and political action. The tobacco industry, faced with this existential threat, was not about to give up without a fight. Instead of accepting the science, they chose to fight it, launching a decades-long campaign of denial, deception, and doubt that would become a textbook case of corporate malfeasance. The scientific reckoning had arrived, but the public relations war was just beginning. The industry was about to reveal just how far it would go to protect its profits, even in the face of the undeniable truth that its product was killing its customers. Chapter 13. The Big Lie, an Industry on the Defensive. Faced with the damning and irrefutable evidence from the Dahl and Hill and Hammond-Horn studies, the tobacco industry was at a crossroads. They could have chosen to accept the scientific consensus, acknowledge the dangers of their product, and work to make it safer or help people quit. They chose the opposite path. The leaders of the major tobacco companies decided to engage in a massive, coordinated, and decades-long conspiracy to deceive the public, to undermine science, and to maintain their profits at all costs. This conspiracy was formally launched in December 1953 at a secret meeting at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The CEOs of the largest American tobacco companies met with public relations experts from the firm Hill and Knowlton. It was here that they hatched a brilliant and deeply cynical strategy. They would not try to refute the scientific evidence directly. That would be impossible. Instead, they would fight science with public relations. Their goal was to create a controversy, to manufacture doubt, and to convince the public that the link between smoking and disease was still an open question. The core of their strategy was outlined in an internal memo from a Hill and Knowlton executive. Doubt is our product. The first public salvo in this campaign was fired in January 1954. The industry took out a full-page advertisement in over 400 newspapers across the United States, entitled, "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers." The statement acknowledged that their customers were concerned about the recent reports on smoking and health. It promised that the industry took these concerns seriously and that they accepted a responsibility to the public. It pledged to support independent scientific research to get to the bottom of the issue. To this end, they announced the formation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which would later become the Council for Tobacco Research. This all sounded reasonable and responsible, but it was a complete sham. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee was not an independent scientific body. It was a public relations front, designed to project an image of a concerned industry while its real purpose was to fund research that would produce inconclusive or contradictory results, muddying the scientific waters and giving the industry experts to quote in the media. For decades, the industry poured hundreds of millions of dollars into this research, carefully cherry-picking projects that focused on alternative causes of cancer, like genetics or air pollution, anything to distract from the central role of their own product. The other key prong of their strategy was a marketing pivot. If they could no longer credibly claim their products were safe, they could, instead, market the illusion of safety. This led to the great filter fraud of the 1950s and 60s. The industry began to heavily promote filtered cigarettes, with brands like Winston and Marlboro leading the charge. The filter, they implied, was a technological solution that removed the bad stuff from the smoke, making it safer to inhale. Ads for Viceroy cigarettes featured a white-coated dentist proclaiming that, as your dentist, I would recommend Viceroys. Kent cigarettes boasted of their Micronite filter, which they claimed was the most effective of all. It was later revealed that, for a time, the original Micronite filter contained asbestos, a potent carcinogen. The filters, of course, did almost nothing to reduce the risk. They were a marketing gimmick, designed to assuage the fears of nervous smokers and give them a reason not to quit. This was followed by the rise of light and low-tar cigarettes in the 1970s. The industry promoted these products as a healthier choice, a way for concerned smokers to reduce their risk without having to give up the habit. This, too, was a deliberate deception. Internal industry documents later revealed that the companies knew that smokers of light cigarettes unconsciously compensated by inhaling more deeply, taking more frequent puffs, or covering the small ventilation holes in the filter with their fingers, thereby inhaling the same amount of tar and nicotine as they would from a regular cigarette. The big lie, as it came to be known, was one of the most successful and deadly public relations campaigns in history. It successfully delayed meaningful public health action for decades, and during that time, millions of people who might have quit or never started continued to smoke, reassured by the industry's false promises and manufactured doubt. It was a strategy that would eventually unravel under the weight of litigation and the revelation of their own secret internal documents, but not before it had caused an incalculable amount of human suffering. Chapter 14. The Surgeon General's Warning. The End of Innocence. By the early 1960s, despite the tobacco industry's massive campaign of denial and doubt, the scientific evidence linking smoking to a host of deadly diseases was piling up and becoming impossible for the government to ignore. A coalition of public health organizations, including the American Cancer Society and the American Heart Association, began to put intense pressure on the federal government to take a definitive stand on the issue. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy instructed his Surgeon General, a folksy, pipe-smoking physician from North Carolina named Luther Terry, to convene an expert committee and produce a comprehensive report on the health consequences of smoking. This would be the U.S. government's first major statement on the issue, and the stakes were incredibly high. Surgeon General Terry understood that for the report to have any credibility, it had to be seen as completely objective and immune from political or industry influence. He assembled a committee of 10 distinguished scientists and physicians from a variety of fields. Crucially, none of them had ever taken a public position on smoking before. The committee was given a monumental task: to review and synthesize every single piece of scientific and medical literature on the topic, which amounted to over 7,000 articles. To ensure secrecy and prevent any leaks or interference from the powerful tobacco lobby, the committee conducted its work under conditions of extreme security. They met in a locked room at the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland. Their work was so sensitive that it was referred to within the government by a code name. Over the course of the next year, the committee painstakingly reviewed the mountain of evidence. As they did so, a consensus began to form. The evidence was simply overwhelming. The statistical association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer was stronger than any other known association in medicine. The report was finalized in late 1963. The release was planned as a major media event, designed to have the maximum possible impact on the public consciousness. It was scheduled for a Saturday morning, January 11, 1964, a time chosen to minimize the effect on the stock market but to maximize coverage in the Sunday newspapers. The press conference was held in a packed auditorium at the State Department. For security reasons, the reporters were locked in the room, and the report was distributed to them 90 minutes before the press conference began, so they would have time to digest its contents. At the appointed hour, Surgeon General Terry, flanked by his committee members, stepped up to the podium. In his calm, measured Southern accent, he delivered the report's devastating conclusions. The report, officially titled Smoking and Health, Report of the Advisory Committee to the Surgeon General of the Public Health Service, stated unequivocally that cigarette smoking is a health hazard of sufficient importance in the United States to warrant appropriate remedial action. It declared that smoking was a definite cause of lung cancer and laryngeal cancer in men, a probable cause of lung cancer in women, and the most important cause of chronic bronchitis. The link was no longer a matter of debate. It was a scientific fact endorsed by the full authority of the United States government. The release of the 1964 Surgeon General's report was a watershed moment in the history of tobacco. It was the end of innocence. It marked the point at which the public could no longer claim ignorance of the dangers. The report was a front-page story across the country and around the world. It triggered an immediate and permanent shift in public attitudes toward smoking. For the first time, a significant percentage of the population began to see smoking not as a harmless habit or a glamorous pastime, but as a deadly addiction. The report also spurred the first significant government action to regulate tobacco. In 1965, Congress passed the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act, which required that all cigarette packs in the United States carry a warning label. Caution: cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health. This was followed in 1971 by a ban on all cigarette advertising on television and radio. The Surgeon General's report did not end smoking overnight, but it fired the starting gun on the modern anti-smoking movement. The tide had finally, irrevocably turned. The decades-long war for public health had begun in earnest, and the tobacco industry, though still powerful, was now, for the first time, on the defensive in the court of public opinion. Chapter 15: The New Frontier, Vaping, Global Markets, and an Uncertain Future. The 1964 Surgeon General's report was the beginning of a slow, grinding, but ultimately successful public health campaign that has dramatically changed the landscape of tobacco use in the Western world over the past half-century. The decades that followed saw a steady accumulation of public health victories. The warning labels on cigarette packs became larger and more graphic. Taxes on tobacco products were steadily increased, making them less affordable, particularly for young people. Comprehensive bans on smoking in public places, from airplanes and restaurants to workplaces and parks, were enacted, which not only protected non-smokers from secondhand smoke, but also denormalized the act of smoking itself, transforming it from a common social activity into a marginalized one. Massive public education campaigns, funded by governments and health organizations, detailed the grim realities of smoking-related diseases. At the same time, litigation against the tobacco industry began to gain traction. Whistleblowers from within the industry leaked thousands of secret internal documents, which proved that the companies had known about the dangers and addictiveness of their products for decades and had deliberately lied to the public. This led to a series of massive lawsuits, culminating in the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement, in which the major tobacco companies agreed to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to the states to cover the health care costs of smoking-related illnesses and to severely restrict their marketing practices, particularly those aimed at children. The cumulative effect of these measures has been a stunning public health success story. Smoking rates in countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom have plummeted from their mid-century peaks of around 50% of the adult population to well under 15% today. For many people in these countries, smoking has become a distant, almost alien habit. But the story of tobacco is not over. As the tobacco industry faced declining markets and increasing regulation in the wealthy nations of the West, they executed a strategic pivot. They turned their attention and their vast marketing resources to the developing world. In the low and middle-income countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with their large young populations and weaker public health regulations, the industry saw a massive new frontier for growth. They have employed the same tactics they used in the West decades ago. Glamorous advertising that links smoking to success, independence, and a modern Western lifestyle. Sponsoring sporting and music events, and fighting any attempt by local governments to implement proven tobacco control measures like tax increases and advertising bans. As a result, while smoking rates have fallen in the rich world, they are rising in many parts of the poor world. Today, nearly 80% of the world's 1 billion smokers live in low and middle-income countries. The global addiction has not been cured, it has simply migrated. And now, a new and complex chapter in humanity's long relationship with nicotine has begun with the rise of the e-cigarette, or vape. Invented in China in the early 2000s, these battery-powered devices heat a liquid, often containing nicotine and various flavorings, into an aerosol or vapor, which is then inhaled. The e-cigarette has created a deep and contentious schism within the public health community. On one hand, for adult smokers who are unable or unwilling to quit, vaping is almost certainly a less harmful alternative to smoking combustible cigarettes, which release thousands of toxic chemicals in their smoke. Many see it as a powerful tool for harm reduction, a way to transition smokers away from the most deadly form of nicotine delivery. On the other hand, the rise of vaping, particularly among young people, has created a new set of concerns. The use of sweet, candy-like flavors has made these products incredibly appealing to teenagers who have never smoked, leading to fears of a new generation becoming addicted to nicotine. The long-term health effects of inhaling the chemicals in vaping aerosols are still largely unknown. The debate rages on. Is the e-cigarette a life-saving off-ramp for smokers, or a dangerous on-ramp to addiction for young people? The answer is likely both. What is certain is that our long and troubled relationship with the tobacco plant, and with its powerfully addictive alkaloid, nicotine, is far from over. From a sacred herb used in ancient ceremony, to the engine of empire, to a global commodity, and now to a synthesized chemical in a flavored vapor, the story continues to evolve. The smoke has cleared from many of the rooms of our lives, but the fundamental challenge remains: how to balance pleasure, profit, and public health in the face of a substance that has brought so much wealth to a few and so much suffering to so many. Allow these thoughts to drift away now. The long, complicated history of this single plant has reached its current chapter. There is nothing more to analyze, nothing more to learn tonight. There is only the quiet of your room, the comfort of your bed, and the gentle, steady rhythm of your own breath. Let it carry you down into a deep and restorative sleep. Good night.